Welcome to our forum on school segregation. And it's especially pleasing that today we have as our featured speaker among many great panelists is Beth Fry, who served as a Vista 3 years ago, which is a year where you basically don't get paid. And she did a terrific job with us and was happy to have her. Normally when we do forums on race and housing or race and anything, we can normally count on meeting somewhere in a closet. This has had a terrific response, and I suspect it has to do with what's going on in the nation. We had 128 people who registered for this, and I want a special thanks to all of our sponsors, which will show up electronically, but a special thanks to Sally Martin, who has blogged on this topic on behalf of the school district, South Euclid-Lyndhurst, and all those people who have gone before us who have worked on racial integration in the schools. And pleasure to have this great panel. Look forward to it. I'm going to turn it over to Sally and let her go at it.
Thank you, Chip, and welcome everyone. This is a topic that I have a great deal of passion about personally and professionally. I'm the housing director for the city of South Euclid. I was hired in 2008 during the height of the housing crisis to try to address the slide that our housing was showing in the wake of the foreclosure crisis. One of the things that became very, very evident to me quickly is that to recover a housing market, one has to have a strong school district. South Euclid-Lyndhurst schools had a great reputation for many years, and then surprisingly had a very, very rapid resegregation. And this became a personal issue for me because my son and my daughter, who had been in private school, and I had to ask myself, why had my children been in private school? When I moved to South Euclid in 2001, I was told by all of the white people that my kids should not go to public school, that they were no good. Yet at the time, the schools were still ranked very highly, and I didn't bother to question it because the family had a history of using Catholic schools, and so that's what we did. And then my rebel of a son wanted to go to public high school, and I relented. Found out it was an incredible school, a great experience for him, and then subsequently a great experience for my daughter. So from that point on, I felt very passionate about trying to dispel the negative stereotypes that were undermining our school district and the public's utilization of them. And then Beth Fry walked through my doors one summer as an Ohio State University student who was in public affairs at the time and had done research on this and had been a graduate of our school district, the SEL schools. So we worked together 5 years ago to start a blog called the Sel Experience Project. The idea was to do a storytelling project to dispel negative stereotypes of our school district. And what we found after doing many, many profiles of students who had been through our schools is that they truly were getting a fabulous education, going on to do great things. And many of them, which surprised us the most, chose to take their talents into a social justice type profession to make the world more equitable. So not only were they getting a top quality education, going to fabulous colleges, they were actually using what they learned to make the world a better and more equitable place. So the tie-in between being in a diverse environment and wanting to move that agenda forward was something that we couldn't deny. So as Beth's education progressed to Cornell University for her graduate degree, she created her thesis based on this topic. And so for the first time, we have is hyper-local research about school segregation. And not surprisingly, what we see is this demarcation line between East and West. And it's no surprise to anyone here that Cleveland is one of the most segregated cities in the nation. So with the Black Lives Matter movement coming to the forefront this year, it's time to tackle this. So I think, bringing people together over this topic is critical. We need to know where to go from here, how to start here with this topic of educating children in public schools, which we all think is critical. It's where diversity and inclusion and equity begin. So I'm going to introduce my panel. So what we're going to do is go through the panelists. They're each going to speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. Then we're going to have a Q&A. And the Q&A we'll do through chat just because it will be a little simpler of a process, and I'll moderate the Q&A as well. So let me introduce them. We have Chance Ahmad, who is the co-founder of Safer Heights. And Chance Ahmad is a Black Palestinian law student studying at the Cleveland Marshall College of Law. He's a graduate of Cleveland Heights High School, and he earned his BS in International Relations from Kent State University. He's also one of the co-founders of Safer Heights, which is a community organization focusing on policing in the Cleveland Heights community. Chance is also a community organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement. Beth Fry is a public affairs professional passionate about the intersection of racial politics and neighborhoods. She's a native of South Euclid, and she witnessed a massive racial turnover during her time at South Euclid Lyndhurst City Schools and has spent the past 5 years studying this issue. She's the co-founder of the Sel Experience Project blog, a blog dedicated to sharing stories of families, teachers, and alumni of SEL schools. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Public Policy Analysis from Ohio State and a Master of Public Administration from Cornell University. Susie Kaiser is an urban planner, writer, and community activist. She has been a passionate Cleveland Heights resident since 1979. Her 2 adult children are graduates of the Heights schools. She's been a classroom volunteer at Boulevard Elementary for 30 years, and for 17 years, she directed Reaching Heights, a support organization for the Heights schools. Susie currently advocates on behalf of public education as the co-convener of the Heights Coalition for Public Education and as the education specialist for the League of Women Voters of Ohio. Susie has a book coming out in September about local activism to support integration in Cleveland Heights. It's called Revisiting Segregation. Cleveland Heights activists shaped their community from 1964 to 1976. It's a celebration of the powerful contribution of grassroots organizations that can be made to tackle the nation's largest and hardest problems, including housing segregation. Susie's a graduate of the public schools of Madison, Wisconsin. Her undergraduate degree is from Grinnell College, and she has an MA and a Master of Urban Planning from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She originally came to Cleveland in 1976 to join the staff of the Cleveland City Planning Commission and was quickly drawn into education issues and urban neighborhoods. She serves on the boards of several nonprofits, including the Home Repair Resource Center and the Heights Community Congress. Laura Meckler is a reporter with the Washington Post and is the national education writer for the Washington Post, where she covers national trends, federal policy, and the education department. She came to the Post from the Wall Street Journal, where she covered presidential politics, the White House, changing American demographics, immigration, and healthcare. Before that, she worked at the Associated Press Washington Bureau and covered state government in Columbus, Ohio. Laura grew up in Shaker Heights and is a graduate of Shaker Heights High School. She got her start writing about everything from schools to cops to the annual Pro Football Hall of Fame Festival at the Repository in Canton, Ohio. And she graduated from Washington University in St. Louis and serves on the board that oversees her college newspaper. So we have links on the web page that you use to sign up that have articles that Laura has written. It has Beth Fry's thesis, and it has several other links that you might find interesting. So this topic is nothing new, and nationally, recently, May 10th of 2019, Gary Orfield published Harming Our Common Future, America's Segregated Schools 65 Years After Brown, which clearly demonstrates that we're no better off now. In fact, we are more segregated now than we were when Brown was passed. And Brown versus Board of Education, as you might be familiar with, was a Supreme Court decision that would have ended or aimed to end school segregation. Where are we now? Well, we are showing now that we are more segregated than ever before. And there's research showing the advantages of integrated schools. One of the ones that most recently published among 50 years of literature showing the importance of this was Professor Rucker Johnson's 2019 book, Children of the Dream, Why School Integration Works. which was a very long-term study of large numbers of African American students, and showed that higher achievement, college success at more selective colleges, higher income, better jobs, less incarceration, and more long-term health benefits arise from integrated school settings. So right now, white students no longer account for the majority of public school students, only 48.4% in the United States. Part of that is lower birth rates for white individuals, the growth of the Latinx population. But what we're seeing in Cleveland is really what we're seeing nationally. And one of the ironies of having this forum today, we recently received, in fact, last night, we got an email from the National Coalition of School Diversity that today, in fact, the House of Representatives is voting on the Strength and Diversity Act, which is one of the policy agendas that would help possibly turn the tide. It would provide grants that could fund a range of proposals, including studying segregation, establishing public school choice zones, creating and expanding innovative school programs that can attract students from outside the local area, recruiting, hiring, and training new teachers to support specialized schools. So they have a policy agenda that was developed in 2019 that also has numerous recommendations. So we provided links to all of these things, which we hope that you will look at and think hard about and advocate for. So I'd like to turn things over to Beth Fry to tell us about her research. And in addition, what motivated her to do the work, what her personal experience was like in SEL schools, and her suggestions for a way forward. Beth?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Sally, for that great introduction. I'm really excited that all of you seem to be interested in my thesis research. Definitely what makes all that time I spent crunching numbers during a pandemic a lot more worthwhile. So just a little background about myself. I grew up in the South Euclid School District. My parents have lived here for over 25 years. And I grew up, I started kindergarten 20 years ago in the fall of 2000. And throughout my course in the district, I witnessed kind of the rapid resegregation of the schools. So when I started kindergarten, they were majority Black, or they were majority white. And by the time I graduated, the district had become majority Black. And so it was something that I definitely noticed as a young child, particularly having parents who are culturally aware enough to talk about racial issues from a young age. And so when I got to college and when I started, really diving into public affairs and what I was interested in the policy space, I got really interested in kind of the racial demographics of communities. And so my thesis comes after I read a piece of literature by my thesis advisor, ironically, about the decoupling of enrollments in public schools and how certain communities might have the majority white, but a lot of the times the public schools don't necessarily reflect the community they represent, which I saw growing up here in South Euclid, where the community itself was still majority white, but the public schools were 65% Black. And so I wanted to take that and focus it into Cleveland and my experience here in Northeast Ohio, particularly knowing that Cleveland is one of the top 5 most segregated cities in the country. And the Midwest in general is actually the most segregated region in the country when it comes to schools. There's greater levels of between district and metropolitan segregation in the Midwest than there are in the South, which a lot of people don't necessarily realize because of the history of the Jim Crow South. And so I really wanted to dive into the reasons as to why is this happening, and what does it actually look like here in Cleveland. So let me pull up my slides. Share screen. Catherine, can you share my slides, please? Sorry, it's not letting me share my slides. Okay. So You can go to the first slide. So one of the biggest things, that I was looking at was, what's the white opt-out rate here in Cuyahoga County? And the opt-out rate is the measure of school-age children within a school district that aren't using the public schools. In the city of Cleveland, which has seen rapid depopulation over the past 40 years and is a majority Black district, about 63% of the white students within the district will attend public schools. On the east side, however, depending on whether you live in the inner ring or the outer ring suburbs, it varies widely. So on the outer ring suburbs, you have about 40% of, only about 40% of the students will opt out of the public schools, but when you live in the inner ring east side, it's almost 70%. And so there's this huge kind of chasm within the research of white children kind of opting out of public schools. And when you get to the west side, it's just over 25%. There's this huge kind of chasm when you look at white students opting out of public schools here in Cuyahoga County, where ironically the districts on the inner ring east side, the Cleveland Heights Shaker, South Euclid, all of those schools see higher rates of white students opting out than the city of Cleveland. And it's a little bit concerning because the average kind of white opt-out rate, or what I would say is the people that would never attend public school no matter where they lived in the county, is 35%. That's the median. So we can kind of expect that 35% of those who live in of school-age students in Cuyahoga County would never attend public school. That happens. There's a lot of parochial school attendance in the county. But then you get into places like the east side inner ring of Cleveland, where you have almost another 35% of students who are not going to the schools that they're zoned to attend. And this creates some issues, but a lot of it, I think a lot of it has to go down to, what is the driving force behind these opt-out rates? And Catherine, can you go to the next slide, please? And a lot of that is tied directly to the percent Black enrollment for school districts. The higher percentage of Black students that are enrolled in a school district, the higher amount of students enrolling in a school district, Black students enrolling in a school district, the more likely white students are to opt out. So for example, the west side, which had the lowest rates of opting out in the county, are less than 5% Black on average. Meanwhile, the inner ring east side suburbs, they have a 77% opting out rate. And so there's this deep, this very close tie between the percentage of a student of a school district that is Black and the number of white students that are opting out of the district. It's also important to remember, or it's when looking at the measure of central tendencies, the average percent Black enrollment in Cuyahoga County School District is 31%, but the median is under 10%, which tells us that there's a high concentration towards one end of the scale, and then most of the other districts. So there's a few districts that are kind of pull the median up, meaning that there's a higher Black enrollment, and then there's a lot of other school districts that don't necessarily have a large Black enrollment. And so that kind of like skews it and says that there's something going on here that we need to look into. Next slide, Catherine. So this is just a scatter plot of non-Hispanic white opt-out rate versus percent Black enrollment. There's a very strong linear pattern here, which is important to note because it indicates that the relationship here is very important and strong. Ironically, there's actually there's one district in Cuyahoga County that actually has a white opt-in rate, meaning that there's more white students attending the school district that live in the community. It's Cuyahoga Heights. It's very small. So it's kind of like the aberration to the data set. But again, this graph kind of shows the strong linear relationship between this kind of data set. Next slide, Catherine. And so there's a wide variability in white opt-out rate throughout the county. So East Cleveland has the highest, with about 92% of white students living in the district opting out. Again, there's not very many white people that are living in East Cleveland. There's only about think there's like less than 50 school-age children who live in East Cleveland that attend who live in East Cleveland in general, and so there's very few that attend the public schools. Cuyahoga Heights has the lowest. Again, they have an opt-in rate, but as you can see, it varies across certain areas. On the east side, there's only two school districts. On the east side inner ring, there's only two school districts that have opt-out rates that are under 50%. The first is Shaker, which has managed to stay relatively stable over the past like 30 to 40 years. Garfield Heights is currently still under, but they're trending upward, meaning that they're having their opt-out rate has increased over the past 10 years. So it's definitely kind of trending upward in a lot of these communities, whereas more Black residents move into the community or utilize the public schools, the more likely it is for white students to opt out. And it's important to like kind of look at a lot of these things, because the relationship between white students opting out and Black student enrollment has a lot to do with the resources that schools are offered. Schools with higher white enrollment rates typically have better funding, better teachers, not necessarily a better quality of education or better results that are kind of tied to anything outside of the normal like family achievement level. But in all honesty, a lot of it has to do with access to resources. So Catherine, can you go to the next slide, please? So this is the non-Hispanic white opt-out rate by the county from 2009 to 2017. These numbers are slightly off because I had to recalculate them. I added in the 2018 numbers, but for the most part, the shading holds up. The area on the east side inner ring has very high levels of white opt-out, whereas you get to the west side, it's very minimal. And then next slide. And then this is the Black enrollment per county. So you have these school districts that kind of border the east side of Cleveland that have very high levels of Black enrollment, and then you get to essentially everywhere else in the county and they have very low enrollments, Black enrollments. And so it's really it's really particularly an issue on the east side inner ring. All right, Catherine, you can close the slides now. That's my contact info if anybody wants it. But so a lot of this information for me wasn't necessarily shocking because I've been working on this for the past 5 years. But I think the magnitude in some of the communities was very high. I think finding out that like the community that I live in, South Eagle and Hearst, has a 75% opt-out rate among non-Hispanic white children was pretty shocking. Which essentially points to like if you see a white kid walking down the street in your community, there's a good chance they don't go to public school. It also, I think, points to kind of the history of racial segregation in this community and the presence of kind of deeply ingrained ideas about what good schools look like versus what bad schools look like. I can speak to my own experience attending Brush. My graduating class was 60% Black, and I think my experience at Brush prepared me a lot more for the real world than a lot of my other friends who I met in college who had gone to big suburban high schools or had gone to private school, because not only did I get a good classroom education, but I actually grew up around people that weren't like me, and I had a greater understanding, I think, of the world around me than a lot of my friends who kind of grew up in little bubbles of white suburbia. And so there are deep benefits to this type of education, and particularly when it comes to addressing school quality issues. When you have schools that are racially integrated, there's more resources available to direct towards students who have learning difficulties, who come from unstable households, and it gives teachers more opportunities to teach as opposed to just being like social workers when you have a class that's filled with 30 low-income children who don't know necessarily where their next meal is going to come from, or where where they're going to sleep, when they're going to get individualized adult attention. And so in terms of these numbers, it tells us that we need to take the time to actually invest in integrated schools, because they produce incredible outcomes. They actually produce better outcomes than most people think. And they give students who don't necessarily have the greatest resources the ability to kind of achieve a much higher levels. I think from a policy standpoint, what are the best kind of ways going forward? How do we address this? I think the biggest kind of most radical idea is annexation into a full singular county school district. That's what they do in the South, and that's actually why they have lower rates of school segregation in the South, is because you have an entire county being served by one school district. That's going to be very difficult to do here in Cuyahoga County, where you have 59 municipalities and 31 independent school districts. There would definitely be a lot of pushback to it, but in terms of kind of like the best way to create a wide scale change, that's definitely the best way to do it. I think in terms of on a more individualized level, my biggest thing pushing this narrative forward is the importance of having conversations within, the white community. You need to be able to talk about, why are you making your school decision choices? What are the factors going forward? A lot of people say that they want better schools for their children, but better is almost exclusively whiter, just based on the research that exists. And whiter doesn't necessarily mean that there's any better outcomes than if you attended public school. There's no research that points to attending a segregated white school produces higher achievement levels than if you attend an integrated school. So I think pushing those conversations forward is the biggest thing that we can do on a next day basis. So that's what I have so far. Sally, if there's anything you want me to touch on.
Beth, there were a couple questions that were really specific to you in the chat that I would like to ask you about.
Okay.
One of them was, isn't Cuyahoga Heights one of the only public districts that allows non-district students to pay tuition and attend there? So do they have open enrollment?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. They might be. I do know, I have heard about students. I have heard of teacher students going there, or teachers' kids going there, but I'm not actually sure. So I can't speak to
someone else in chat seemed to confirm that they did indeed have open enrollment, which could explain something about stick out as an anomaly.
Yeah. It's also small. And so Cuyahoga Heights just does its own thing in terms of the data set.
And then we're going to talk a little bit further with the other panelists too about one question that someone had, which Emily had, about the conversation about students opting out makes the parents somewhat invisible. Who's educating the parents around this? And that's a great question. And I think we need to focus on that. It's true. And I think with just our small little pond in South Euclid, we've actually brought people who would follow our blog together in a room. It was quite an interesting experience for us. And, we had people crying. There were just emotions that were flying high. They had made these choices to send their kids to an integrated school, and they were receiving a ton of criticism from other people. And I think there's pressure on parents, and that has to be discussed. So if we could go on to Chance. Chance, I'd love you to tell us about your work with Safer Heights, how that got started, and your own experiences attending the Cleveland Heights, University Heights schools, as well as what you feel the people could do differently to create more equity and inclusion. So we'll move on to Chance.
Yeah, so I just want to thank the sponsors of this panel for inviting me, first of all. Also seeing some very familiar faces throughout the participants, specifically Lisa Baruch, who was one of my 9th grade teachers. So it's really good to see you here today. So, I mean, the first thing that I kind of want to talk about is the stigma that surrounds like public schools and especially Cleveland Heights. Hi, Ms. Baruch. So one of like the most jarring memories that I've had about Cleveland Heights actually didn't even come within Cleveland Heights. It happened when I was at Kent State University doing my undergrad. I ended up going to a restaurant and overhearing this conversation between these two gentlemen talking about Cleveland Heights. And they were referring to it as, quote unquote, like everyone knows like it's a rough neighborhood around there. The school system is very rough per se. And it just became like really clear and evident that they had never like stepped foot within Cleveland Heights High School or like our system. Because if you attend there or you have your children attend there, you know that that's like a negative, like a false perception of Cleveland Heights. And when you walk in, there's this very real sense of community that goes on with that. So that was kind of like the way that Cleveland Heights, I guess, is framed to other people, and that's how they talk about it. So when it comes to segregation, why would you send your kids there if you know that that's the stigma that's being like talked about and associated and going around with Cleveland Heights? So I kind of just wanted to open with that, and now I can talk a little bit about my work with Safer Heights, which is a newer organization that started in June of this year during the wake of the George Floyd protests and the entire Black Lives Matter movement. So if I'm just going to read off our mission statement, Safer Heights is a Black youth-led organization that aims to fight systematic racism or anti-Black racism, and to make Cleveland Heights a safer place for people of color and all people. We're composed of residents, Heights alum, and we believe that only when we come together is change possible. And only when the voices of the unheard can be heard, then we can have a safer Heights. So it pretty much just speaks to our mission of equality moving forward, and that is true within the school system as well. One of the things about our school system is like we don't even get to have like our first Black Studies or African American course until high school. So one of the goals that we tried to do was meeting with the superintendent, trying to see how we can implement those types of classes on all levels of our school system, elementary, middle, and high school. Because when we don't get that holistic view that Beth was talking about, she kind of referred to getting that experience and that view through her experiences in the public school. And while we definitely do get some sense of that within Cleveland Heights, we could even do better and one-up ourselves on that level. And I think that really implementing those Black history courses on this elementary and middle school level can speak to that as well. Because at every stage in that experience of the Cleveland Heights public school, you have more and more white people opting out and sending their kids to private school. Whereas like when you're in elementary school, we have a demographic that's around 50-50. And then like towards high school, that balance shifts to 80-20 in terms of Black students to white students. So why are we seeing that? And maybe if we had some more classes which address like Black issues and Black understandings, then that might want kids as well as parents to opt in a lot more moving forward and going into high school. And so when we talk, like when we're talking about the high school, I can only speak to my experience, which at this point was between 2010 to 2014, and we are still using small schools. There was about, so for those of you that didn't go to Cleveland Heights, I should probably explain this because it's a kind of a weird concept. So within Cleveland Heights High School, there was 5 schools, like 5 smaller schools. So Pride, Real, these are just the names, Pride, Real, Mosaic, Legacy, Renaissance, were all of these 5 schools. And they were supposed to be geared and tailored to specific things that would represent the students. Mosaic was supposed to be like an art school. I can't really remember the specific qualities of each school. All I can remember is Mosaic is art, because obviously Mosaic has to do with some type of artistry. But within Cleveland Heights and within the small school system, we saw a large amount of the white population of students. Oh, thank you, Ms. Baruch. We saw a lot of the concentration of white students in the Renaissance school. And within the Renaissance school, we also saw a lot of classes offered, such as like the AP language or the AP psychology or the AP microeconomics that didn't occur within all of the small schools. So within that, you had to go to 3rd floor, top right. That was where you were going to get these classes. And which is really unfortunate, because a lot of the Black students in our schools did not get to access these courses because they were stuck in these other small schools that they didn't get to go to. So I know that I'm almost 3,000% sure that they don't use the small school system right now. But when I was going there, it was so evident that things were divided internally along these lines. So it really speaks to not only that external pressure of like, am I going to send my kids to Cleveland Heights High School, but within Cleveland Heights, how are they going to get this education? And what they did through these small schools was kind of segregate things along those lines as well. So one of the things, like I said, that Cleveland Heights, that Safer Heights is trying to do, is not just in our approach to addressing policing in Cleveland Heights, but is also addressing the education system and trying to implement more Black courses within our schools. And then one of our other core demands is the removal of police officers from schools too. And that is so we don't have this overwhelming sense of pressure on Black students within our school system, whereas they're felt like criminals, and they're being watched and constantly surveilled, to where people are waiting for them to mess up, and schools aren't being treated as schools, but an overly securitized place. And we want to try and kind of eliminate that school to prison pipeline. And we believe that eliminating the police in schools is just one version of that, especially in a school that already has security guards, which deal with all these everyday scenarios. And then I guess I also want to talk about things like in Cleveland Heights that we used to use, most notably like the Delisle Center, which was like kind of like this banishment, other building that we would send kids to for getting in trouble. So it was this building on South Taylor, where if you would mess up and you would get in trouble, you would be going to this Delisle Center, and that's where you would be serving your in-school suspension. So you are completely removed away from the Cleveland Heights public system at this point and put in this Delisle Center, which really like exacerbates this sense of othering that a lot of Black students felt when they would get in trouble. And there wasn't any type, there was a punitive kind of judgment that happened within the Cleveland Heights school system, and Cleveland Heights specifically, but you would also get sent to the Delisle Center from time to time that would be a more extreme form of punishment to remove you completely from the school system. And so I think that talking about stigma is one of the biggest things that we could do in addressing like the segregation in our school system and how we talk about Cleveland Heights, how we talk about the Black community in Cleveland Heights as well, and our school system as a whole. Yeah. And so I think the last thing about Safer Heights that I would want to plug in is if you want to follow some of our work, we are going to be having a forum with some of our city council on Thursday of this week from 5 to 8. And if you want to register for that, I can drop the bit.ly in the chat. And these are some of the kinds of questions that you can also ask our city council and how we can move forward as an entire society in addressing these inequities that we're seeing.
Thank you, Chance. I'd like to move on to Susie Kaiser, who has worked for decades on this topic, and I'd like you to respond to what you've heard, Susie, and also just tell us what you think about this topic.
Thanks a lot. It's kind of fun when I see all the names of the people here. I think I'm talking to a lot of people I've known a long time, and that's nice. I think there are, Chance, I think you're talking about a lot of issues that are important. I think achieving a highly successful integrated experience is difficult work. I think it's work that our school district is committed to doing, and it doesn't always get it right. I think we've gotten rid of some of those things that you are referring to, and I think I very much appreciate your interest in having African American history and scholarship as a centerpiece of learning in our schools. And I think my kids are 10 years older than you, and during the time that they were in the schools, and they were always in the minority in every building that they attended, I was really taken by how much African American writers, history, scientists, accomplishments were infused into every part of the curriculum, particularly in elementary school. So, but I think that a lot of the pressures on standardized testing and some of the other imposed things have in some ways undermined some of our best work that was ever done on this. And over time, people have, I just think, continuing to advocate for the inclusion of that perspective and those contributions should be essential. And I think the school district, it's one of the few places that has done an equity audit of its own behavior and is focused all the time on doing this. So doing it well is really hard. And I think we have a district that's committed to doing it well, even though we may fall short at times. I wanted to talk just a little bit about really what I see as the real threat to, and part of, I mean, the numbers on opting out are heartbreaking. And I think, like so much data, you have to get the data tells you there's a problem, but to get at why it's happening is much more complicated. And it's quite different depending on where you are. And certainly, so in our school district, for one, which Bob Brown pointed out in the chat, we have a significantly large Orthodox Jewish population, which was never going to be part of our public schools. And so this isn't, so you look at the demographics, and that's part of the reason why the public schools don't mirror who goes to them or who lives here. But so let me start by saying I am an unapologetic advocate for public education. I believe that guaranteeing everyone the right to free public education is one of, which is in a high quality public system, is one of the best ways in which we can achieve equal opportunity. I think that the strength of our democracy depends on a public system that guarantees equality for all. Our public system exists to serve the common good, and the beneficiary of our public system is our communities. We are all interconnected, and a public system is unique and special because of its role in our society. I'm also an unapologetic advocate for integrated schools. I believe kids learn both from who they go to school with and who teaches them. And if you're going to really have a robust quality experience of learning, the best way to do it is in a school that is diverse and that represents the people in our society. I think integration, really high quality schooling that makes everybody included, is the hardest job there is to do, and it's worth fighting for, and we need to do it. I'm heartbroken by the opting out pattern for many reasons, but mostly because it undermines the viability of our public system, and it also reflects an ideological shift that puts individual rights ahead of the common good. So a lot of this choice stuff, which has been sold, choice is sold as a great idea, but it is really about individual rights and not the common good. And so I believe that that's one of the big issues that is driving this increase in opting out, which has really occurred over the last 20 years with the increase of privatization and the use of public funds to pay for charter schools and vouchers to private schools. So it's not just race that's driving the decision, but underneath it, I believe race is driving it. I think the state policies related to testing and privatization is making it increasingly difficult to sustain commitment to our public system and to integration. It has normalized choice and separation over learning together, and it also helps really to disguise the role of race in those decisions. So we no longer need realtors to do racial steering as they did, and to control who lives in our communities. We have a state report card that does it instead, and it's seen as a legitimate measure of school quality when it is not, and it is causing great harm in my view. So could I see the first slide? So as I was researching my book on the ways in which white people in Cleveland Heights fought to integrate our community, I came across this report by Barbara Heald, who was a member of the League of Women Voters, who gave a talk about what the main ideas were that people gave openly about why they did not want their community to integrate. And these kind of racist attitudes, I believe, are still at play, and they are maybe not consciously in a lot of people's minds, but these are ideas that have been ingrained in our culture for 400 years. And, you know, I think this is something we have to openly challenge. One that applies to schools is Negroes are less intelligent and more criminally inclined. And then there's the fear of intermarriage if you live in an integrated community. While this was not that long ago, that these were commonly held, openly expressed attitudes, and there are attitudes still at work here. I just wanted to put that out there as something that we need to remember is at play. Most of my professional career has been spent advocating for the Cleveland Heights University Heights schools. And in the mid-1980s, as the school district was integrated, the Heights Community Congress, the Interfaith Council, and the Board of Education agreed that what they needed to do was appoint a blue ribbon committee to evaluate the quality of education in our schools. So the issue always comes down to quality. And they thought that this would be the very best way to convince people that integrating our integrated school system was still a high quality system and that people should participate in it. As most of us know, that when people say, oh, it's the schools, what they're really saying isn't the quality of instruction in the schools, it's who's going to the schools. And so it's a very, I think, delicate issue here. So we've all worked extremely hard to validate that our public schools still are schools of quality. And for me, a school is not quality if it is not diverse, but that is me. So I think that one of the lingering issues for white people at that time and to this day is, are these schools good enough for my kids? And this kind of entitled attitude is a very difficult one to deal with. And so one of the outcomes of the Schools Consensus Project, which reported, we visited every school, we talked to everybody. It was very reassuring that we have a high quality school system. But one of the things that we decided to do as an outcome of that was to create Reaching Heights, which was about 10 people met on my deck, and we created this nonprofit support organization for the public schools. And I'm really happy to know that Krista Hawthorne, who now directs Reaching Heights and is still carrying on the work of that organization, that she's on this meeting, is at this meeting. I became the director in 1991 and worked there for the next 17 years, doing the work there was no separation between my work and my passion. So supporting our public schools was a wonderful thing to do. We know that high quality depends on adequate funding. And the main thing that we can do ever is to, if we're fighting for integration, we have to be fighting for high quality schools. That is what you should focus on, serving the children who use your schools. And our focus during my work at Reaching Heights was really to try to maintain public confidence in the public schools so that voters, 3/4 of whom do not use or have children school age, would continue investing in this public institution so it could deliver the high quality of education that our community wanted and expects. We did a lot of fun things. We had a spelling, our goal was really to rally the community and instill our sense of responsibility for our public schools, to not let them drift off to the side and then be discounted and thrown out. We did newsletters trying to tell the story to people. We did plenty of grants to great teachers. One of our great assets of our district is our music program. Reaching Heights we started a music camp that continues to support high quality music in the district. So there are a number of things that we've always done that were designed to really enhance the quality of instruction and to connect the community and a sense of ownership for its schools. I don't believe we ever convinced one person who didn't want to be a public school parent that they should be, but we sure did make it easier for people who had made that decision to feel confident that they'd done the right thing. And as one person mentioned, there's a lot of pressure on parents that somehow they're being bad parents by participating in an integrated system. So I think, to me, what there is to do to control this is really just about making sure your public system does a good job. But I think that I think maintaining confidence in the public schools is the critical thing to their sustainability. And sadly, our state policymakers have completely worked against against public education. So since 1983, with A Nation at Risk, that was the beginning of a public narrative that said public schools are second-class institutions, that they're weak, and so they started to create the doubt about public schools. In 1997, the state of Ohio started its first voucher program in Cleveland, and it started its first charter school experiment in Toledo. And since then, privatization has slowly but surely creeped into and dominated public policy in the state of Ohio. So that our legislators we have 5 different voucher programs, and we have a huge billion-dollar investment in charter schools. So the Cleveland people have a remarkable amount of choice of where to send their kids, much bigger than existed when we first started working on maintaining and promoting integration. And not only have they more choices, but there is an ideological promotion that it is your individual choices and rights are more important to having a public system that guarantees everybody access. So if you live in Cleveland Heights right now, you can attend 11 different public schools and 11 private schools that exist within the boundaries of our community. Only one school district has more, and that's Parma. There are 13 private schools in the boundaries of that community. We have 1,400, last year, 1,400 students used vouchers to attend 34 different private schools. And we only have 340 kids who use charter schools, but they attended 43 different schools. So while you think of, so our public schools are in competition with 100 schools in the region, and they're in competition for public funds. So the state has diverted public funds to pay for these private options. And they've increased, and they also now assign to Ed Choice districts the cost of them. So can I have the second slide? So the real threat to me really is both standardized tests, which are used to define education quality, and then using that to define who can have public funds to leave a public school. So I want to. So these school districts are. There are 40 school districts in Ohio that were defined as Ed Choice and between 2015 and 2019. No new districts were added before 2019 because they kept changing the tests that were used to define a failing school. So I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. If you're not conversant in Ed Choice vouchers, let me give you a little bit of how it works. This voucher program was designed to help, it was sold to the legislature, by the legislature, to help children escape failing public schools. So the state legislature has embraced a narrative of school failure first. They had to justify the public schools are failures as a way to justify the unconventional use of public funds to pay for private education. So in order to evaluate the quality of schools, they conveniently drew on our state's testing system. So standardized tests, which discriminate by income, which are a shallow measure of learning, an unreliable measure of learning, and a terribly limited definition of school quality. We use that now in Ohio to define a failing school. And if your school is defined as failing, then anybody who lives in the attendance area of that school is entitled to have a publicly funded scholarship, regardless of your economic need, to a private school. And so it's a ghastly system. And then the public school system must pay for the cost of that voucher. So what essentially happens is that if you look at which school districts in our county, and if I've looked at the data for school districts across Ohio, the school districts that lose the most money to pay for vouchers, the money you need to deliver a high quality education, are schools that have high poverty and generally serve children of color. So the students who are most dependent on our public system to provide them a high quality education are being deprived of it, so that other students can use a voucher. And I would like to add that in our community, 90 out of 1,400 students who receive vouchers ever set foot in our public schools. So while this was designed as a system to help kids escape failing public schools, it's really supporting an education choice made a long time ago to support private education. But it's facilitating this huge amount of segregation and resegregation that we're seeing now. So can I see the next slide? So in 2019-20, 200 more school districts 100 more school districts had failing schools, and that added 3 more districts in Cuyahoga County. So this is a much less homogeneous group of districts, but there are individual buildings in each of these districts that serve concentrated poverty or racial segregation. And the next one, next year, the legislature, they keep changing the criteria for defining a failing school, and they've made it so loose that last year 400 districts were going to have ed choice buildings. And these districts were set to become ed choice, but because they were wealthy and they had oftentimes were evaluated in every other criteria as superior, it became obvious that the legislature had a big problem with their ed choice. And so they just froze the addition of new districts, but those districts are slated to become ed choice next year if the legislature doesn't act. So just in conclusion, because of this ideological commitment to individual choice at the expense of the common good, we have now a state report card that uses a terrible metric that measures income more than anything else, allows for very simple grading of the quality of education, which people legitimately want to know what the quality of education is, but it's really not what it's telling you. And it's really creating a threat, not just to integration, but to public education itself. So EdChoice has normalized the use of standardized tests to define quality. It has promoted a narrative of public education as failing. It undermines quality by taking funds away from public schools. It discriminates against districts that are integrated by race and income, and then makes them much less viable because it drives up local property taxes, which is the only way you can make up for the money that school districts are now having to spend on private education. It's a disaster for public education, and it's a disaster for equity, and it's a disaster for integration. So what is there to do? First, we need to advocate for House Bill 305, which is the Cupp-Patterson bill, which actually may move, which actually promotes a new system for better funding of public schools, and it also takes the cost of privatization off the backs of local school districts. It doesn't take away privatization, but it ends the deduction funding, and that has to happen if you want to maintain quality in any of our school districts. I think we have to challenge the legitimacy of a state operating a dual system of publicly funded schools, one that's accountable and one that isn't. We need to end the use of standardized tests for any purpose other than informing instruction. We've been misusing it all over this state. We need to throw it out. And we need to demand a high quality education and a very robust definition of what that means. We need to advocate for public education itself and challenge this narrative of failure. And when we advocate for social justice, we need to call a discriminatory policy discriminatory. EdChoice and our way of assessing school quality discriminates, and that's despicable in a state, for state government to discriminate. So that's what I got to say. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Susie. I'd like to move on to Laura Meckler, who will give us more of a national approach as well as a deep dive into the Shaker schools that she is currently writing a book about. So Laura, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Currently writing, maybe slightly overstating, but currently exploring perhaps. Hi, I'm Laura. Thank you so much for having me. I did grow up in Shaker Heights. I went to the Shaker Heights schools from kindergarten through 12th grade. As Sally said at the beginning, I'm now a reporter for the Washington Post. I was interested in writing a story about Shaker and about its long-term efforts at integration, and also where it was falling short. And I ended up developing that last year into a major story about Shaker, but also a series about school segregation across the country. And what we explored in that series is how segregation and integration can exist on a lot of different levels, some of which have been alluded to already in this conversation. But I think it's helpful to think about it in this frame. And that is the way that we traditionally think about school segregation is how evenly distributed are the children in a given district. That's what Brown versus Board of Education was about. The fact that within a school district you had Black schools and white schools. So that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is on the classroom level, which is something that I looked at when I explored Shaker. And then, as Beth said at the beginning, it's also you have segregation between districts where the boundary lines are drawn. And in states like Ohio, there are quite a few school districts, so you have a lot of different choices about where to live, and that essentially you're choosing based on what sort of community, including the racial demographics that you want to live in. And then finally, as Beth's research points out, you have segregation that can exist based on whether people choose public or private schools. So I think it's important to think about it, and there are different dynamics driving all of those. One thing I just wanted to offer, and I'm not going to linger on it, but one of the findings we found in our series is that even though it's commonly said that schools are more segregated than ever, or that we've completely resegregated, that's not actually the case when you look at all American schools, school districts. In big cities and in inner ring suburbs, which of course is the topic of today's conversation, yes, schools are quite segregated in terms of how the students are distributed within a district. However, in other parts of the country, more rural areas, places that used to be all white and now have typically an influx of Hispanic students, we see far more integration. And in fact, our analysis found that the number of children who are learning with children of other races has nearly doubled over the last 25 years. And after I finish speaking, I'll put a link to that story in the chat in case anyone would like to see it. But there actually is a more complex story, and I think that it's important that we look at it in its fulsome nature. So that said, I want to talk a little bit about Shaker. So I grew up in Shaker. Anyone who who lives in Shaker, or if you've lived near Shaker, you know that it has a rich history of integration, which is a large part of the community's identity. It originally was formed as a very elite community, very wealthy community, a completely white community. But in the 1950s, the first Black families moved in, and what resulted was an effort toward stem white flight and essentially promote integration. And what followed from that was the Shaker Schools Plan in 1970, which involved voluntary busing to integrate the schools, and then ultimately a rezoning of schools so that each individual school building in Shaker Heights, the elementary schools all the way up to the high school, reflects the community as a whole. And you've seen, while the schools have shifted from when I was there about 50-50 Black-white, now it's a little closer to 60-40 Black-white, they have maintained a diverse student population, even with consistently that opt-out rate of white families leaving has been there the whole time. You do have white families who do choose private schools, but there are still a substantial number who are choosing to participate in the public schools. And I think it's important to look at why that is and how Shaker can maintain that, because it's something that I think people in Shaker are mindful of and wanting to maintain white buy-in to the public school system. If you talk to people in Shaker Heights, they'll tell you that nobody lives there who doesn't value diversity. And you'll also hear a lot of people say things like, if any place can figure out race, it's Shaker. You know, I grew up with a very utopian view of what Shaker Heights was about, but, you know, in fact, you really do have a more complex system when you go more deeply into it. And Shaker has a real struggle with diversity in the classroom. There is a lot of internal segregation at the high school where the advanced courses are much more heavily white than the lower level courses. And that's something that the district has tried to tackle. And if people want to talk about that, we could talk about it during the discussion period, but it is a challenge that they have. But it relates directly to this issue of opt-out. And again, I want to bring us back to where Beth began this conversation. And that is, the question is, how do you get white people to invest in the school system with their own children? How do you get them to continue to attend public schools? And so the school district's challenge, and what is an imperative, I know for Shaker, and I'm sure for other districts as well, is to try to keep those white people invested, people who have other options. And also wealthy Black people, but it tends to be mostly white people who, as Beth's data shows, who tend to opt out. So how do you keep those people happy and at the same time drive an equity agenda where you are giving equal opportunities to all students, and you're integrating the classrooms as well as the buildings? And this is a fundamental tension that Shaker grapples with in terms of promoting both equity and also keeping, maintaining what white families will view as a school system that serves their children well and that has, promotes excellence. So those things certainly do not have to be in tension at all, but there tends to be a perception of that tension, and it's a real thing. And you can't just sort of say, well, you're wrong, and we're going to do this whether you like it or not, because people can leave, and you've seen that that's what's happened with Shaker's neighbors, and to some extent in Shaker as well. So it's important that a school district grapple with these questions and find a way to have buy-in for the whole community while also promoting equity for the whole community. I think that is in many ways like the most important challenge that school districts are facing right now. Wanted to just also comment on a couple points made earlier by other speakers. Beth said that her preferred solution to this would be to create a single county district, and that you would then promote more integration. I would just like to, if we're going to think about that as a solution, that is what happens in the South, and they do have more integrated schools typically than the Midwest or the Northeast does. However, if we're looking at opt-outs, that would actually probably drive more opt-outs, not fewer. So I think it may lead to more integration among the public school kids, but I think you might end up, again, driving more people out of the system. So that's a complicated answer as well. But it doesn't really matter, because politically it's essentially zero possibility, as would be my guess, give or take, 0.1, but most likely zero. I think that the other harder solution, if you will, to this involves conversations among families and about what they value and what they want to do with their children. And I think that where you have seen success, and what my reporting has shown where success happens, is when there's a sense that people are in it together, and that sort of everybody kind of jumps at once. So there have been communities where white families have put their kids into majority non-white schools, and they've done it not one person, one at a time, but as a group. And there's a little more sense of security in those situations. And I think that that's something that people might want to think about. Last point I want to make is that I think, as Susie said, that the question of whether are individual rights being put ahead of the common good. I think it's really hard to talk to parents about making choices with their kids for the common good rather than what's good for their kids. It is an extremely hard sell to say to any parent, essentially, don't do what's best for your kid. Do what's best for all kids. And so I don't think that there will be some people who make choices that they don't think are best for their child, but most people will always make the choice that they think is best for their child. So the question becomes, how do you tell parents, and how do you get parents to believe that what's best for their child is a public school, is a diverse environment. And I think that that's where the work lies, rather than trying to guilt people into doing it. It's to try to persuade people and present a program that makes people feel good about it. And I'm not saying that that's an easy thing to do, but I do think that that's where ultimately success may come. Another one of the stories I did last year as part of that series was in Brooklyn, where they actually have a integration plan that is now in place in a Brooklyn district for middle school. Some of you may have heard the podcast Nice White Parents, which is also about that same district. And it ends with an integration plan in place. And the way that happened was because there was buy-in from white parents in that area who wanted a more diverse school system and didn't like the one that they had. And there were things that were unique to that situation that don't exist elsewhere, but it happened because it was done collectively and everybody did it together. And I think that that's ultimately where the solutions are, and that involves a community-wide conversation about what we want for our schools. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Laura. So we do have a lot of robust comments and questions in chat. So I'm going to go ahead and go through some of those and have the panel feel free to respond as you wish. One of the questions we just got, well, it's not a question. We have a few comments too. And one is that Eileen Beal is asking you, Laura, to address the geography issue that entices people to move to Shaker Heights, which is close to downtown, a short commute to employment, and plenty of money these people might have to send their kids to the many private schools within 5 miles of Shaker Heights. So what is that? How's that impacting things?
Well, I mean, Shaker was founded with all of those things in mind. In fact, there are private schools in the boundaries of Shaker Heights. You don't even have to go 5 miles away. There will always be people who make those choices. There are some extremely wealthy areas of Shaker Heights, as anyone who's driven around there can attest to. There also are some less wealthy areas, such as where I grew up, but there are some very wealthy parts of Shaker, and yeah, some of the people will always make those choices to go to private schools. I don't know if you're ever going to stop that from happening.
Interestingly enough, as we were sitting here, I got a news flash on my phone from one of our local news organizations that said the Ohio State school report cards just came out today. So even though they were, cut short and abbreviated by COVID and they couldn't do the full thing, they have come out with the report cards today. So I do want to also point out that we are putting links for things that people have shared with us in chat, also a recording of this program on the website. And if you register with this panel, you're going to have it emailed to you. Otherwise, you can check the webpage and you can get all of those links. And we'll also put a link to the new Ohio State report card, which I'm sure we're all waiting to read with bated breath. In addition, Laura Meckler is also sharing in chat all of the different pieces that she's done this year as well. So let me say that one person also, and I know, Laura, this kind of touches on some of the work that you did with the piece that you wrote for the Post. It says the Shaker School District eliminated the core CP classes, lower level, and tracking, which locked students into a path of courses. There are still AP IB courses that are segregated, and I know that came up in your work. And this was Karen Galuli's question.
Well, what's happened just this year, Karen, if this is what you're referring to, is that there's, what they're doing is they're creating essentially an Honors for All program, which other school districts have done as well, where all students are being taught at the honors level. So there have been basically 3 levels, sort of college prep, honors, AP, and they're essentially collapsing the first 2 into one course. So the idea that kids will be all taught together, and where the teachers are challenged to essentially differentiate among students, so that if some kids need more, they get more support. So that is an effort to make those classrooms more integrated, and also to raise the standards for all students. I've seen it tried in a lot of other places. I hope it's successful in Shaker. It's the kind of thing that makes some white parents uncomfortable in Shaker, just to be honest. So we'll see how it goes over. And also some teachers who don't like the fact that they're put upon now to essentially have kids of varying different abilities in the same classroom. Other teachers think it's great. So it just depends.
So,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Susie.
I want to respond to something you said, Laura, about parents making decision what's best for their kids. The common good issue is really about state policymakers and having them sacrifice scarce public funds to support private education in order to promote individual rights as opposed to the common good. So I'm not talking about individuals not making decisions for their kids. I think we've always done that. It's interesting that we tolerate a lot of that, and we do a lot of, this is what's good for my kid as a cover often for, this is what's uncomfortable for me and I want to avoid it. So I think I'm not as indulgent as you are of individual catering to white parents' interests. I think we really want to change this. We really have to confront those concerns and worries. And well, I want an inclusive public system, and that means I do want white parents to be part of it, but I'm afraid that we've always thought that their interests were more important than anybody else's, which is why our efforts at Reaching Heights and in my own, what I've come to with my philosophy is we need to provide really great schools to the kids who participate in them. And we need to help people understand that good school, that schools are good, that our public schools are good, and we need to guarantee that they have the opportunity to be good by investing in them. So my approach is more along that line, because I think we need to engage people about their fears, but I don't think we need to.
But look at it. I mean, there's
all of them.
And the thing is, this exists on so many different levels. I mean,
Yes.
Are there anybody in this call who will send their kids to the Cleveland Public Schools? I mean, that would be a question I would ask. I don't know if maybe there are people who do that, but the people, my friends who I grew up with in high school, I don't know any of them who sent their kids to the Cleveland Public Schools, because they're not viewed as being good. And they're also, as it happens, almost very, very few white kids in them. Now, the question that kind of calculation takes place in so many different ways. And it's interesting because if you look at Beth's research, you see let's say you go out further to Pepper Pike, say, and it's a lower opt-out rate, but those people have already, quote, opted out of a more diverse school district by moving to a whiter community. So people are always going to be making choices, given the system that we have, based on what they perceive as best. And where people live is very much driven, if you have kids or you're planning to have kids, based on the schools. So we have to, be honest that people are making these decisions based on these perceptions. And I don't know exactly what the answer is for that, but I do agree that you need to educate the kids that you've got, and you need to do a good job with them. But I mean, if we think that diverse schools are important, we also have to think about, how can we create schools that will draw a diverse set of families to them.
So I just wanted to jump in and talk about kind of Laura's point to, the families moving out to, like, you have families that move to Pepper Pike and versus Cleveland. And one of the reasons why, again, we cannot kind of agree that like a countywide school district in this region of the country just doesn't work, because it doesn't mesh with our history of local control and how we kind of navigate local issues. But one of the reasons that countywide school districts typically do better is because it removes choice. And so one of the things about the Ed Choice program, they talk about how, it gives, now there's private schools that you have to compete with as well. And when you remove kind of the existence of small, very tiny suburbs, creates fragmentation that allows people to kind of like pick where they want to live based on the like package of goods that they want. And so by kind of eliminating that and creating like a larger school district, you essentially say like, this is what you get, and you either have to move out to Geauga County, or you're sending your kids to private school. And so like part of that has to come in with the presence of municipal fragmentation is also a huge driver in segregation.
But, you know, Beth, that's true. But at the same time, even if there was one big Cuyahoga County school district, do you really think that their kids who live in Warrensville Heights would be bused to perma? I mean, in today's world, that probably would not happen. So you still would have some level of neighborhood schools, most likely.
Yeah, I mean, in some senses, I do know that in Louisville, because I do cite Louisville within my paper. In Louisville, they actually don't do neighborhood busing. They do like a ranked school choice preference, and that does take into account. They got hit by the Supreme Court that they couldn't use race as a factor, so they found the next best thing, which is socioeconomic status, and so they do factor that into it, and it's actually worked out pretty well. And Louisville's court order, like busing, you know, desegregation court order ended in 2000, and the program's still going 20 years later, despite, you know, some rises in city council members and school board members who don't particularly like it, but it's fairly well received within the community, within, you know, Jefferson County, Metro Louisville. And they do have, you know, it's a kind of a source of pride for a lot of members of the community. So it's definitely like a you know, a countywide school district isn't necessarily, you know, it's not like a one size fits all, but there are ways to make it work. There's also how when the Charlotte-Mecklenburg County schools integrated in the 60s, 70s, where they redrew county lines so that instead of going in like neighborhood schools, they drew everything out like a pie so that you had the center city, which was mostly Black, and then you'd also have kids out from the outlying areas. And so there are different ways to do it. Again, it's no one size fits all, but there's definitely case studies in which you can kind of look at it.
No, I agree. You're absolutely right. That those have been successes, and it can work. I don't think politically it will happen in Ohio, but I absolutely agree with you.
We have a question from Bill Shaw. What are the most proven effective arguments that have persuaded parents to go with diversity or integrated schools? Now it's the $20 million question. Panel to tackle that.
I mean, at least from my standpoint, in doing research, and as someone who attended a diverse public school with parents who, my parents are both from like rural America, both went to all-white high schools and actively chose to send my brother and I to, you know, a much more integrated school than we did. A lot of it comes back to, I think, is kind of hammering in the idea that in-school factors actually don't affect overall achievement as much as we think they do. Right. Going back to the 60s, we know that the single greatest predictor of academic achievement is like income and like socioeconomic status and parental education level. And so I think, you know, for me, at least whenever I talk to people and I remind them, it's, you know, I went to this school that was quote unquote bad, but my parents were able to kind of make up for anything that was lacking. So I think a lot of it is just reminding people that your school doesn't actually affect, the quality of your school doesn't actually affect your learning ability or like your achievement level, particularly if you're coming from like a higher socioeconomic status. Where you really see the difference pay off is in, you know, in those who come from lower socioeconomic statuses, where kind of any advantage you can get really is helpful. Like my dad's an engineer, my mom's a food scientist. I, you know, went on historical vacations out the wazoo. You know, there wasn't a whole lot that, you know, that was going to hinder me. Like I was going to do well no matter where I went to school. And so I think kind of proving that and using that as kind of a conversation starter is super helpful. And I always like point out to people when they tell me that Brush was a terrible school that like my brother went to Northwestern and like works for some like global consulting firm. So it can't be that terrible.
Susie, you look like you have something you want to say. You're muted, Suze. You're muted. Yeah, there you go.
I'm back. Okay. I had a professor in college that knew I had something to say. The first time I spoke in class, he could see it on my face. It got me to speak. The argument is a social justice argument. It's a benefit. It is in your self-interest to be well educated, and to be well educated is to be educated in a public school where you unite with the people who live in your community. And that is the argument I will always make. That it's interesting. I don't agree with. I disagree with. I mean, I agree with you, Beth. It's really interesting. There's research that says 17% of student learning is affected by what happens in school, but we obsess about how high quality the school is. I think we can all feel fairly confident that our public schools are full of well-educated, I mean, a public system requires high quality. They're highly regulated. We expect people to be credentialed. We have high expectations of what we are providing to the public. That's why we justify using public funds for them. We don't do that with our private schools that we're funding with our public funds. And we're doing the public a disservice in not making them, not protecting the needs of their children by demanding that their private schools do the same as our public schools. So in any case, my argument is really one that, our fear, you have to put your fears aside. You have to acknowledge where they come from. And you need to have confidence in your children. Our children are remarkable learners, and put them in an opportunity to learn, and they will. I think we often try to protect way too much. And a lot of what we need is to trust them and to trust children, regardless of their backgrounds, as being other learners. And that's what these schools are about.
I think also going off, there's also there's research that says that segregated schools actually benefit no one. So there's this idea that if you send your kid to I don't know, like Hudson or something, that it's going to be better, like they're going to get a better education. And the truth is there's no actual evidence that supports that. When you go to diverse public schools, you're typically getting, not only a classroom education, but you're getting a cultural education as well, which is super important. I also think, at least in Cleveland's issue, like one of the things is that Cleveland is I like to call it a big small town, and the fact that like everybody that most people that live here are from here, or at least that's what I've encountered in my however many years of being from here. And so it's very easy for everybody to have like deeply ingrained ideas of what these communities look like, or what they're supposed to look like, and how, back in my day when this school was 100% white, these things weren't happening. And so I know, at least in my case, like I mentioned, neither of my parents are from here. And so when they came and settled down, it was a much different, they weren't coming in with like the preconceived notions compared to a lot of other people. And they're both very big advocates of public education. And so I think that's, in many ways, it can be a disadvantage, is because when you have people coming in and they have their deeply ingrained tendencies and their opinions about what's a good school and what's a bad school, there's issues with that. And I think a lot of it comes from, there's a lot of the ideas of what the good schools and bad schools are perpetuated by the adults and then repeated by their kids. I had numerous friends that went to private school to be like, oh, Brush is a terrible school. And I'm like, you don't know anything, but okay.
And I think even touching on that, like the original question is like, I think a great way to kind of tackle this issue is like, how do we build a bigger sense of community within our school system, where people can facilitate these conversations? I know like when I was growing up, my mom was like very involved in like the PTA, the Parent Teacher Association. And so we felt deeply invested into our community. And that was like one of the reasons that a lot of me and my friends ended up staying in that community, because people felt involved and they felt rooted. So how can we start to get more people in that? It doesn't even need to be a PTA, but within some type of community organization where they can have these conversations, and where they can tackle like these stigmas of what's going on in their community, and honestly putting more pressure, because if you're if you feel deeply ingrained in this community, you're not gonna feel more inclined to leave it. So how can we put this pressure on people to care about our community and move forward?
One of the things that I wanted to kind of, and I think someone mentioned this like really early on in my presentation, but how people, people often talk about, these opt-out rates and like, of course, no one goes to the Cleveland Heights School District. They're terrible. Like, why would they? And someone asked about what the Black opt-out rate is. And that's actually something I have looked into, and I have it in my spreadsheet. I have a pivot table of it pulled up in my data workbook. The Black opt-out rate is actually kind of all over the place. Like when it comes to the white opt-out rate, it's very clear and it's very much driven by locality and its relationship to the percentage of Black students enrolled in the district. The the Black opt-out rate is just kind of all over the place. Ironically, the districts, and again, this is looking at districts over 10 years, the districts with the highest Black opt-out rate are actually predominantly white. And a lot of that, at least I've heard anecdotally from friends and acquaintances over the years, is, you're dealing with like cultural issues of, some families don't necessarily like the idea of their kids going to school where there's, only 5 to 10% of the student body is Black, and any kind of like bullying or discrimination that might go on there. But then there's, I think the average Black opt-out rate is actually a negative number, meaning that most districts have Black students opting in as opposed to opting out. And so like Cleveland Heights might have like an 80% opt-out rate of white families, but they have like a 2% opt-out rate of Black families. So the school districts cannot be that terrible if the Black community, and theoretically those who the like Ed Choice Voucher program is trying to assist, aren't actually opting out. So it's kind of like this hyperbole of course, like it's not what you think it is. And like a lot of people's general assumptions about school quality are just kind of generally off.
We have a question in the chat from Phil about the property tax funding of schools, which of course was held as unconstitutional by the courts, but the legislature has not acted. And further saying that Cleveland does not have the property tax base for quality schools. Would the panel like to comment on that? Because that is a huge issue.
So, I mean, I can go. I mean, my personal opinion on the whole using property taxes to fund schools itself, at least from my personal like academic opinion on this, is that the taxes themselves are not inherently unconstitutional. The taxes are just the mechanism with which it's used. It's the underlying inequality of housing values and housing values that kind of drives that, and it's how they're collected. And so because they're collected on a hyper local level, everything from the community goes to, you get what your community brings in and then nothing else. If you collected property taxes and then had them all sent to the county or sent to the state and then divvied out from there, it'd be a lot more equitable. But I think blaming it on property taxes in general is not necessarily, that's the taxes are just the mechanism. There's greater structures, I think, at play that affect. And so, I mean, even if they just amended it a little bit.
I have strong feelings about this one. So, the state legislature has a constitutional obligation to provide for a system of common schools. It's the state responsibility to fund the public schools. We have historically got this really interesting partnership where local communities pay part of the cost and the state pays part of the cost. That's a really good idea. But the local contribution comes from local property taxes, and we know that property values vary widely from community to community. So the role of the state contribution, the higher the state contribution, the less that difference in property wealth plays into educational opportunity. But in our state, we've got, I think it's 40% comes from state, 60% from local. It should be flipped. And at that point, and so one of the ways in which the deduction funding of vouchers is so egregious is that most of the vouchers are being paid for by communities with low property wealth, which means that the local taxpayer has to tax themselves at such a high rate to make up for that loss of funds. So the inequality that comes out of this reliance on local property taxes is just horrible. But that's one reason why the funding system for privatization is so wrong and why we shouldn't allow it at all, because it drives so much inequality in education opportunity. So I think I don't think we should eliminate local property taxes, but the role they play just has to be minimized, and the kind of inequality in taxpayer burden that it now exists has to be dealt with. I can't believe I care about taxes.
Well, as we know, Susie, the taxes do drive people out of our communities because, you know, yeah, as our tax base is more burdened, and yeah.
The greater their local burden, the less appealing your community is. And then the less likely you are to attract a diverse population. And, you know, so it drives down the attractiveness of a community, and particularly, so school funding has a lot to do with the demographics of communities.
Any further comments from the panel for that question? We also had some robust, we've had a very robust conversation going in chat. If anyone hasn't looked at it, they might wish to. A lot of people making comments and then commenting back and forth to each other on things. One question, you know, was, will Cleveland be cannibalizing some of the suburban schools because of Say Yes, the Say Yes program in Cleveland providing college scholarships? There's a lot of back and forth about that, which is income restricted, so that may not be attributable, but also Cleveland having so many magnet schools, I think would be worth this panel discussing. You know, they've gone in that direction, and that's probably why their opt-out rate is lower, because people can choose Campus International and John Hay and other schools. Would you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's research done when a paper was written by my thesis advisor and another Cornell professor. There's research done that shows that the presence of like magnet schools and like specific programming within school districts often reduces opt-out rate, particularly among like middle and upper middle class white students, because parents can playing into like former stereotypes, they can kind of like steer their kids into a program that is seen as much more robust and challenging, and it also creates kind of a plurality of other white families that like might also be in the school district. It doesn't bode well for like local neighborhood zoned communities, because if you can opt out or opt into a magnet school, then like your neighborhood local school will end up being much more hyper segregated. But on the district level, there's benefits to it. So again, it's a very complicated and like complex issue, but it can help on the district level, but it can hurt on like a very hyper local level.
Magnet programs are a perfect example of what we're talking about. Magnet programs draw white people, other people with options back into the public district, which is good, but it segregates them within the district in certain schools. So and the same thing happens on a building level with advanced classes. It segments them within advanced classes when you offer more of those. So these are all trade-offs here. So you just have to be aware of them. But magnet schools are not necessarily, they're an answer to getting more people invested in the public system, but they are not an answer to integration per se, if you're talking about creating schools that reflect this district as a whole. You know, that said, most big cities, their magnet schools are not majority white. They might be a third white, say, which is far more white kids than you'll find in the district as a whole, but is not reflective of the overall demographics. But is that a win or not? It just depends on your point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Beth.
I was just saying, and another issue with a lot of those magnet schools is that their admissions are test based. I know New York City has had a huge issue, has had a lot of issues with this, with Stuyvesant High School, kind of their top level high school, having issues of Black underrepresentation for the district. The school is overwhelmingly, I think, has a largely Asian population, and then white being the second largest demographic, but the school district as a whole, which has, a substantial Black population, that school's enrollment is much smaller. And so, yeah, the problem with a lot of the magnet schools is when you get into the entrance exams that are required, there can be some issues. So.
Well, there's a question too about the influence of ALEC and Americans for Prosperity on choice legislation and the long-term goal of destroying public education. Susie, would you like to comment on that, or one of you?
I'm glad to comment it. So it's the American Legislative Exchange. Is that what ALEC stands for? In any case, this is a right-wing think tank that creates model legislation that has been carried by Republicans across the nation to implement privatization of public institutions, including public education. So there is it's not just libertarian, but for example, Betsy DeVos, who is our Secretary of Education, actually believes that there's not enough religion in public schools, which is why she is very supportive of privatization and vouchers, because most every private school that accepts a voucher is a religious school, and that vouchers are a way in which we can promote more religion. Well, while vouchers were challenged in the Zellman case in Ohio based on the Cleveland Scholarship Program, and was found not to be a violation of the separation of church and state, which I would say now 20 years later, you would have a hard time not seeing that it is completely about supporting religion and education. But in any case, ALEC has a high level of interest both in privatization and religion, and advancing an agenda that dismantles public systems. Matt Huffman, who will be the president of the state Senate, are you president of the Senate? He'll be the leader of the state Senate in Ohio next year, is completely, his goal is to make this a consumer item. You give money to every family and they go and shop around and choose the school they want. He is interested in total privatization of public education. And we should not ignore the real threat that's coming from this movement that is well-funded, does a lot of contributing to public officials' campaign funds. So we have a real threat to the public system that is being encouraged nationwide by this think tank that comes up with model legislation. We're in trouble.
Anyone want to comment on that further? Because we also had a question regarding poverty and its role in creating the segregation, because someone pointed out in the Cleveland Heights School District, the increasing poverty level, more so diversity, could be having a factor.
So the interesting thing about that is that most of the research says like poverty, it's not poverty that causes it, it's racialized poverty, because low-income white individuals are still more likely to be located to quote unquote better schools, are much more likely to be located towards near better schools. And most families, when they locate into districts, they're much more likely to look at racial demographic of the community as opposed to what the median income level is. And so it's not necessarily that poverty itself is the driving factor of opt-out or school choice. It's not that there are more poor people that are moving into the districts, it's that there's more poor Black people moving into the district, which is the driving force. And I think that's really important to remember, is because whenever we talk about social justice issues, there's a tendency to kind of separate race and socioeconomic status, but particularly in large urban areas, they overlap so much that you have white families who have greater access to opportunities, and then you have the poor Black community, and so it's not just poverty. It's racialized poverty, and racialized poverty is one of the biggest drivers of kind of that decoupling of families opting out of public schools and into private schools.
I just wanted to.
Oh, go ahead, Chip. Oh, you're muted, Chip.
I just wanted to mention one of the big issues in the Cleveland schools and Cleveland in general is our big industrial driver is hospitals. And as everyone knows, they pay no property taxes. And so university hospitals, the clinic, all of them that are located in city of Cleveland don't pay any taxes. There are school districts and communities where they opt in to paying what they call in lieu of taxes, not taxes per se. And that makes a big difference in terms of being able to have the resources around locally to deal with these issues. I fear that, my planning friends who have been in love with the idea of tax abatement for years have robbed a lot of school districts of resources that they need. And especially these, the big medical operations, the clinic and UH, et cetera. It's a terrific drain on resources, and they are making money. They're making pots and pots of profits, and they need to step up to the plate and donate some money.
Thank you. One of the questions we had in the chat, and it was something I meant to address at the beginning of the panel, but I failed to, is the lack of persons of color on this panel. So that is a very important question. It's worth talking about. When we pulled this panel together, we were going with this local approach to Beth's research, and then we also knew that Susie has been organizing on this for decades, and also Laura Meckler had done some national work at the Washington Post. We hope that this is the jumping off point for many, many such conversations that bring everybody to the table, not just this small group. We were focused on one thing, but we certainly want this to be the jumping off point for a broader discussion. And we'll see if the federal legislation has any legs today and if it goes anywhere, but we all need to be joined on this conversation. So yes, we want more persons of color in this conversation. We hope they will be. And as we come up to the top of the hour, I would just like to thank the panelists for being part of this, and also all of you who participated. Very, very robust discussion in chat, which shows us that this conversation needs to continue, and we plan to keep pushing this agenda. And in closing, if there's anything the panelists would like to say in closing or final remarks, please, you have a couple minutes, go ahead.
So I think I just want to say, first of all, thank you everybody for being so interested in my research. I greatly appreciate it. It makes, finishing up my master's feel pretty nice. But I think one of the big things that I want to just jump back to, as someone who did attend a racially diverse school district and has spent much of their, very short professional career dealing with this, is that it's really important to recognize our framings of this issue, and often how we talk about, the need of white students to be enrolled in schools so that we have diversity, and the benefits of having those resources and access to those resources in classrooms. But it's equally important for white students to sit next to Black students, because you learn much more, you become a better person, you understand the world around you a lot more. And part of being a good member of your community is not believing you're too good to send your kids to school with the people that live down the street from you. So that's kind of my final soapbox for the day. And thank you very much for being here.
I could just keep the original order that we started in. I want to thank everyone for attending, first of all. And I think, to conclude, what I want to stress is we need to start having these preliminary conversations of talking about why we're not sending our kids to public school, challenging anti-Blackness in our communities. That is one of the contributing factors to people not wanting to send their kids to public school. And then also having these conversations within our community about what we could do moving forward and how we could become a better community. Once again, just thank you all for coming and having me on this panel. I really appreciate it.
I'd like to just follow on that, Chance. I really appreciate your interest in community and community connection is really as the vehicle for moving forward. I think that's the only way when people interact, that is how you solve problems. And you develop that deeper commitment. I'm a public school advocate. I'm really, really worried about the future of public education. And if there's anything we can do, we must raise our voices in support of its public purposes.
I would just say thank you again for having me on this panel. It was a very interesting conversation that we hit quite a bit of education policy here, local, state, and federal. I think ultimately what these questions come down to is what people want for their own communities, and they have to, and to the extent that this changes or doesn't change based on individual behavior, it's about what people's values are, and whether they're interested in acting as a collective towards those things. That otherwise, I think that essentially. Seeing data like this isn't going to really necessarily change anybody's mind. In fact, what it would probably do if your average parent saw these data is they'd say, who was in public schools, they'd say, oh, maybe I should be opting out too. Why? What? What do I not know? So I think that it's important that the conversation happen about what people want from their schools and the values that diversity brings, and for all kids.
Thank you again to the panelists. Please know that all the links to the resources are in chat and also will be posted on the webpage, and we hope you have a great day. Thank you.